You set up a first date with a girl from Tinder, and she shows up in a wheelchair that she didn't tell you about. What's your next move? Roll with it. I'd be glad I didn't get stood up. Sick ride. Where'd you get it? Traded some kid back in town. Straight up. Just when I thought you couldn't possibly get any dumber. You go and do something like this and totally redeem yourself. At least you won't be walking out on me like the last one. Wheels can be faster than legs. Rolling around at the speed of sound. Be too afraid to talk about it and risk offending her. So instead, I just play dumb like I didn't even notice the wheelchair. And then you marry her out of guilt and have kids. But her issue that I still pretend I don't know exists years later turns out to be genetic, and I play dumb as the doctors try to explain that they'll need wheelchairs too. Turns out it can be spread through sex, but symptoms only come out years later. You'll need wheelchairs too. This is why I try to create an open dialogue about my disability when it comes up. I suspect a lot of men are too afraid to ask me the questions they're really thinking. I'm glad they don't want to offend me, but I also think many of them assume things that aren't true and then bail. When it comes up, there's the issue, it wouldn't. But yeah, there's a lot of questions I wouldn't want to ask, especially on like a first date, but I'd want to know the answers too. Like I wouldn't want to end with you thinking I only want one thing, or worse, that I fetishize the disability, but the entire time I would be trying to gauge sexual compatibility, and thinking asking about it is a bad idea. So assumptions would end up filling in the gaps. Also, the irrational fear of stuttering my words and saying really when I mean to say really completely unintentionally. I can't speak for all disabled people, but for me, I bring up the conversation before, if possible. And during the first date, I have my basic accommodations listed on my dating profile, but it's better handled in a face-to-face conversation. There's always follow-up questions brewing, but not everyone asks. A lot of people jump to false conclusions like disabled, paralyzed permanently. I'll share at a high level what my disabilities are and the types of accommodations I need for dating and relationships. Sometimes I can feel the vibe shift negatively, and that's that. But if they seem receptive and curious, I'll throw in a feel free to ask me questions if you have any. The last time that happened, my date then asked me if I had AIDS. That was so far out of left field, I just had to laugh a little and then clarify that no, I do not. I never would have guessed he was wondering that, so I'm glad he asked politely, even if it was a little awkward for a second. Just be respectful, curious, and non-judgmental when asking questions about someone's disability. Understand that they don't owe you their detailed medical or sexual history just because you're on a first date. A good rule of thumb is if it's a question you'd ask an able-bodied person in the same setting. It's fine. So if you wanted to gauge sexual compatibility on a first date, something open-ended like what makes for a great physical connection in a relationship, or is fine. Take her to Disneyland. Skip all the cues. After a long day of fun and laughter, ride her all the way home. Ride her. Did he stutter? Not to mention the disabled parking spots. Hit all the downtown locations. I guess I'm eating out a chick in a wheelchair. This sort of happened to me. I'm a woman, though. I knew he had raced motorcycles professionally, had had a bad accident, and was paralyzed from the waist down before I met him. What he wasn't open about was his lack of motor ability in his hands. So that was surprising. But we had an enjoyable time and a good conversation. He wanted me to push his chair around, and I figured why not? Must be hard wheeling yourself around all the time. Non-electric chair, the wheels had knobs he could push against, and he was generally a nice guy. He had made some statements, however, that were just untrue. And that was disappointing. Mostly about his level of mobility in his hands and arms. Talking about shoulder ribs and playing cards, Trivial Pursuit, chess, cooking together, things like that, all of which were impossible. But I get it. So while it took some getting used to the idea, it wasn't a deal breaker for me. He lived in a section of his parents' house, so he had had help if he needed it, but in his own sort of apartment, which I never saw. Third date, we were supposed to go see a hockey game. I couldn't make it that night, so he said no problem, and I figured he would take one of his friends, but he went alone. For some reason, unknown to anyone, he stopped by the side of the road and exited his vehicle, adapted van he had that he could drive, and he was found the next morning. Passed away, Canadian winter, so I didn't have a chance to get to know him better, but he was a very nice person with a huge heart, and it didn't take me long to see past the chair. How sad. I'm sorry. I proceed to have a date and ask her why didn't she tell me. I proceed with the date, but I damn well know the reason already. I look on the bright side that I can park closer to all the places we go. Go on the date. Ask her about it in a sensitive way because she probably was afraid people wouldn't date her if they knew. If all goes good, start planning our trip to places where wheelchairs jump the line. We go into all the theme parks. Enjoy my date with her. I've dealt with chronic pain from a back injury that took away my ability to walk for a good year and a half. So I would honestly love to meet someone who knows about that and has experience and shares those perspectives about things. Even if I didn't have that experience, I would enjoy a date with her and see where it went. I would have zero issues dating a woman in a wheelchair. Yeah, my BF is an amputee, hip disarticulation. I didn't even notice the first couple of hours when I met him. We exchanged numbers, and once I saw him in better lighting, we were at a party. Was when I noticed he wasn't wearing his prosthetic that day. I've had to learn a lot about how life is as an amputee, but I'm happy to have him by my side every day. You never know where you'll find love. Probably wouldn't have bothered me back in my dating years, as long as we clicked and had things in common. Now, if I was into things like rock climbing that she couldn't do, and she wouldn't let me do it on my own because she can't be included, then I might have an issue unless you're willing to give it up for her. People change and grow over the years, and what may be a priority now may not be years later. My wife and I have been together almost 25 years, married over 20, and we're not the same people we were when we first met, nor do we have the same interests. I'm middle-aged now, and not the same as I was in my 20s. There's probably a reason she didn't mention it, either because it's a non-issue to her or it scared guys away when she did, and she just wanted you to give her a chance and get to know her as a person. I grabbed the club steering wheel lock out of my car and attach it to her chair so that she can't escape. So, funny story. In college, I hooked up with this girl, and it was a pretty wild night. Like, I'd never had sex like that before kind of night. Well, anyway, next morning, I'm in the dining hall with my buds, and they asked what her and I did the night before. They saw us leave the party together, so I told them it was the hardest banging I've ever done in my life, which was true. I felt like I had just worked out all day. Then, just as I'm finishing up my retelling of events comes the girl I had hooked up with, and she was in a wheelchair. We were floored, and I distinctly remember one buddy asking me, "Bro, what the fuck you put her in a wheelchair?" Well, turns out she was a twin. Really funny way to find out considering the circumstances. It wouldn't matter much to me. I had a crush on a girl in a wheelchair in middle school. I think the concern comes down to how much you have to do to accommodate her. It might start to feel one-sided, or that she might be pressured to do more to make up the difference. I just want to know she can take care of herself and us looking for a partner and not a caretaker. Lots of people in wheelchairs are handy, capable. The assumption that she is not is toxic. If she wasn't fitting about the chair, it could be that she wasn't looking to deceive, but rather felt it didn't define her. That said, you should know that while you might be tempted to push the chair with her in it or casually sit in it when she's not in it, but both are huge fox passes. It falls under bodily autonomy. Always ask before touching the chair. If you're walking uphill, she might appreciate a push, and that would be an appropriate time to offer, but otherwise it's considered rude, as awkward as that sounds. Depends. Is it permanent or temporary? Does she still experience genital sensations? I wouldn't date her romantically if she had no genital sensation. I need mutuality in my sex life, and that wouldn't feel right to me. But if she were cool, I'd like to be friends. FIUE, most wheelchair users are ambulatory and have genital sensations. Permanent paralysis is a very small subsection of all wheelchair users. Didn't know about this, thanks. In this hypothetical, why didn't I notice the wheelchair? If she's from Tinder, it would be pretty hard to hide that in photos. I had one date where it was in one photo and in none of the others. No mention on her profile otherwise. Order drinks. The world's too much of a wet mess to allow myself to add to it by being intolerant over something like that. More stories on the channel. RedStore.